name is Steve Cropley, and I'm here to tell you about one of the most amazing books I've ever read. I spent the last couple of nights with my nose in it. It's called Norman Conquest, and it's the life history so far of a remarkable friend of mine called Vic Norman, who has done just about everything there is to be done with cars, motorbikes, and aeroplanes. And the best news of all is that Vic, the author, is with me today, whatever the hell time this goes out, to tell us all about it. Welcome, Vic.
Oh, welcome. It's great to be able to talk to you about it, Steve. And, as you know, it's the first thing I've ever written. And, well, why did I do it? I mean...
Well, let me start with that. I know you reasonably well. I've known you for the last 30 years. And the thing I've never seen you do is write anything. I've always thought you'd rather pick up the telephone. So what on earth made you write 85,000 words with your own hand?
That's what I'm most proud of. I learned to two-finger type because my writing's so bad, even I can't read it. So,
so you started writing this longhand and couldn't read your own writing, so you learned to type. That it?
Correct. Yeah. But, I started because my grandchildren, I've got lots of grandchildren, and they'd never met my mum or my dad. My dad died when he was very young. He was only 46. And I just thought it would be nice for them to know a bit more about my side of the family. So I thought it would be about 5 pages and get it printed at local printers. And I started doing it about 12 years ago. And then I lost the notes, and then I started again. And then lockdown came, COVID came. And I thought, God, I'm going to be so bored. I've got to do something. So I started doing it. And that's what actually made it happen. It happened because of lockdown.
Yeah, amazing. But I mean, your dad, you've had this life of cars, bikes, and aeroplanes that we'll get into, but he was very influential on you, wasn't he?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, I idolized him. He wasn't a great dad. He was never at home. And, my mum and dad had sort of lived apart from when I was about 10 years old, I suppose. But he was always there. And I just loved the things he did. He was, he loved everything mechanical. He went into the Merchant Navy, can you believe, when he was 13 years old, doing an engineering apprenticeship. And he was an engineer, and he just loved mechanical things. And that rubbed off on me. He made decent amount of money, so he could have all the toys.
Right. The toys were things like, give us a flavour.
Well, the first toy I think I really remember him having was actually, he came roaring up the drive of our house on a Vincent motorbike. I didn't know it was a Vincent. It was a Black Shadow. And I must have been about 4 or 5 years old. And this thing turned up. He had his suit on and his tie was round, no helmet or anything. And I kept looking at this thing, and next morning, his factory was about 4 miles from where we lived. And he said, "Do you want to come on the bike, boy?" And he lifted me up and he put me on the tank. He said, "Hold on there, no helmet, no nothing. I mean, you'd be arrested today." And I went 4 miles on that Vincent to the factory. And yeah, I mean, that's what started it all off, I suppose, that Vincent motorcycle.
Well, you've had a few, haven't you? Got a few, haven't you?
I've got a couple, yeah.
Yeah. And then what? I mean, there's talk of go-kart racing and stuff like that, right?
Yeah, I mean, I very quickly got into mechanical things, really, because I just loved anything mechanical. And I remember wrecking 1 or 2 lawnmowers, and at the weekend, taking them to bits and putting a plank in. And, we used to make the old-fashioned soapboxes you steered with your feet.
Yeah.
We all did that stuff, but I did it by screwing a plank to the lawnmower, and then the blades were still whirling around. I'd go flying around. I mean, highly dangerous, all tied up with rope. And of course, no one was really taking any notice. I was just let to do this stuff, and yeah, that led to go-karting, I suppose. And I'll tell you what happened with go-karting. My dad went to America. I think he went to see Joe Louis fight, and he went over either on the Queen Mary or the Queen Elizabeth. I don't know what it was. And not long after he got back, this this go-kart arrived from America with a Clinton engine and a big open exhaust. And it turned up at home and you had to push start it. It didn't have a clutch. And I completely wrecked the garden with this thing. I went charging around, completely wrecked. But through that, my dad got friendly with a most lovely man, and he was called Big Alf, and he was known as Man Mountain Dean, and he was a professional wrestler. And he was the softest, nicest, kindest man you'd ever meet. But he played all the bad parts in those British early 50 films because he was so big. And I remember going to Tilbury, and he opened, I think, the first go-kart track in London at Tilbury Docks. And I remember going there and driving a go-kart around there. I don't know, I must have been about 6 or something. And that's what got me into racing, I suppose, and karting and anything like that. Yeah.
So you've had these kind of phases in your life, haven't you? The motorbikes have been a lingering hobby. In fact, you and I have been in the same dopey event for old blokes, the Pioneer Run and so on. We're going to do a bit more, aren't we?
We are. We're looking forward to it. Yeah. Well, yeah, the go-karting all stopped because I was at boarding school, and I'll get on to the cars. I had to forge my license because in those days you weren't allowed to race. The RAC wouldn't let you race unless you were 16. And I was like 14. So I forged my birth certificate and sent it off, managed to get a license, started racing go-karts. And then, yeah, when I left school and I'd met Chris Craft, the saloon car driver, and we used to go to Brands Hatch pretty well every meeting and watch him race his Anglias and Capris and all that stuff. And I suppose it was just terribly exciting. And then in 1971, I met Alan de Cadenet, who's actually with me now. And Alan really was then preparing a car to race at Le Mans for 72, the Duckham Special. And while I was there, I was working, doing a bit of work with an engineering company, and it had gone broke in 1971 when Rolls-Royce went into receivership. And he said, look, you don't want to why don't you just buy an old car and start racing? And, you know, a bit of luck, you'll make some money and be able to sell it at the end of the year. And, you know, that's actually what happened. And it was by default, it wasn't by any good judgment, for God's sake. It's just that the stuff I ended up buying and using was just going up in value all the time. But of course, I got it terribly wrong, like everyone else. I mean, I bought a GTO Ferrari, and I'd paid a world record price actually for it. I paid £13,000 for it. I hate talking about money because money's never been an issue with cars with me. It's just having the passion to have the cars. And I remember the guy who I bought it from, a lovely man called Pete Newens, who owned the Queen of Hearts, I think it was, cake shop in Newbury. Pete the Bun, we used to call him. Pete the Bun. And I remember being in his sitting room and agreeing to buy this car. And he said, you know, he was going to buy a very nice silver Ghost. He wanted the money for that. And he said, you know, Vic, someday this car is going to be worth £1 million. I thought he was completely and utterly off his rocker.
And now it's 10 million or more, probably.
Yeah, now probably 30 or 40 or 50 million. Who's to say? But you know, I sold it because I needed to pay kids' school fees and got a world record price. I got 20 grand for it, which was fantastic. And what was quite amusing, a few years back, when they were only worth about 30 million GTOs, my son came to me. He was a very good mathematician. And he said, Dad, I've been working the figures out. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, if you'd have borrowed that money from the bank, this is the interest you'd have paid. You could have done this, pay for all our school fees, my 2 sisters, and you could have now given us £5 million each. I said, Sam, that's why I sent you to school, so you could work it out. Now bugger off.
And there are plenty more cars, were there? GT40s, 300S, all kinds of things. So name some names. Tell us about
Yeah,
some.
well, yes. Okay, well, yeah, I had one of the 289 AC Cobras, and I bought that brand new at Earls Court Motor Show. Went on the stand, and I had terribly long rock and roll hair, and the guy on the stand, he wouldn't let me on. Someone sort of recognized me, and I don't know why. And he said, no, let him on, let him on. And I met this lovely salesman called Adrian Judd. And AC cars were just such lovely people. And I remember buying this Cobra, and I think I paid £1,750 for it with Dunlop wheels and a works hardtop. And that was our pretty well only car. My Anne used to go shopping in it. And when we had our first child, the carry cot would be put inside it. And AC cars were great. I remember going along the Kingston bypass, and the front wheels suddenly let go and came up, started burning its way up through the bodywork. And I drove off on the side of the road. And I rang up, managed to get a lift back home. I rang up AC Cars the next day and I told them what had happened. They said, don't worry, leave it with us. And 2 weeks later, they said, come and get your car. They'd completely repaired it. They completely repainted it. It was like a new car again. And they're just lovely people. So yeah, the Cobra was a lovely thing. The GT40 came about. There was a funny thing about the GT40. I don't know if I should tell you about it, but I don't think it's in the book. The GT40. So it was owned by this American guy who had a program now on TV, Vic Norman. He had the car.
Oh yeah, he's a singer, wasn't he?
And he used to drive on stage in the GT40, I think, and get out. Anyway, I bought the car off him. It was quite cheap. It was probably about $4.5 grand or something like that.
Wow.
And I ended up, and it was on racing tires. It was terrible on the road. It ended up being my wife's shopping car. So that was the car she used to use every day. And I remember then I needed to sell it again to get something. And I advertised it for sale. And this guy turned up, and he was known as Monkey Brown. Well, he's a well-known car dealer. And he turned up and he wanted to buy the car, you see. So he looked at the car and he said, well, yeah, okay, I'll have the car, but I've got this big diamond ring. I want you to take that in part exchange. I said, well, I don't want a diamond ring. He said, no. He said, walk up the road with me now. Right, this is near where I lived. Yeah. Walk up the road to the jewellers and we'll go in the jewellers and see what it's worth. So I thought, well, fair enough. Went to the jewellers. They said, oh, no, we'll give you $4 or $5 grand for the ring. I said, oh, fine, okay. Went back to where we were, ended up doing the deal, right? He drove off in the car, and I went back to the jeweler and said, okay, here's the ring. I'd like my $4 grand. He said, oh, no, we don't want it. And of course, it was a con. He'd already been to the jeweler's shop. Oh. So I really thought I'd had it, you know. But luckily, he bought the car, sold it straight on to Hexagon. And what I had done is kept a logbook because it had my dad's personalised number on. And I ended up getting all my money back from Hexagon, who did the right thing. And they had the ring back. So that was a GT40. Good. And then I suppose the car I probably loved more than any of the other cars was my 250 short wheelbase Ferrari, which we drove all over Europe, and I raced it in France and with the French Ferrari Owners Club, and
where did that fit in the sequence?
That was before the GTO. That was pretty well after the Cobra, I think, probably. Right. Got that quite early. I kept it a long time. Paid $4.5 grand for that, and I really wish I'd have kept that car. It was just a lovely thing. Yeah. And I raced it a lot and used it a lot, and it was a great fun, reliable, comfortable car. Where the GTO, great looking car, but not as nice to use as the short wheelbase.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, people say this, don't they? Those of us.
Yeah.
Many people can make the choice, to be quite honest, Vic.
Well, there you go. But, you know, I only ever I wasn't a collector. I couldn't afford to be. So I had to sell something to get something else. And then I managed to get this D-type Jaguar. So I had a D-type. I didn't realize how famous it was. It had been a Hexagon had had the car, but it was an Ecuria Cos car, MWS 302. And it won Spa with Ninian Sarnison and Ron Flockhart. And it was in a bit of a sorry state. And I sent it down to Lynx Engineering. They rebuilt the car. It should have been a short nose car, but it had a long nose. And I raced that car quite a lot. And the one car I always just wanted, without a shadow of doubt, was a 250F Maserati Grand Prix car. And I was very friendly, and still am, with Neil Corner, big car racer.
Yeah.
And Patrick Lindsay, God bless him, who was the head of Christie's. And Patrick had one of the 57 Works cars that had a pretty hard life, I have to say. I think Innes Ireland owned it for a while, and it had quite a lot of crashes, lots of new parts made. But it was basically the continuing, whatever, as Jenks used to say, it had continual history. Yeah. 2527. And basically I was at Silverstone with racing my D-type. I drove there, didn't have a trailer, drove there on the road, raced it at Silverstone. And Neil asked me to go into his motorhome. In those days, he was the only person with a motorhome. And Patrick was there. Neil said, look, I know you want a 250. They were always too much money.
Yeah.
Always, they'd gone up to be worth ridiculous amount, 30 grand or something. And, Neil said, I know you want 250F. Patrick likes your D-type, although he's already got one. He wants to do a swap. So I said, well, okay. So Patrick walked in. Neil said, Vic wants to do a swap as well. So literally on a bit of paper, we just both wrote, I give you this, you give me that, no money exchanges, swap. So then I owned the two. I couldn't get home. So I rang Anne up, who hadn't come with me. She was looking after one of our babies at the time. And I said, oh, look, can you? And she said, oh, no, you've crashed a car. Oh, no, what? How about you? All right. I said, no, I'm fine, but I haven't crashed a car. I've sold it and I've got a single seater and I can't drive it on the road. And I loved the 250F. It gave me the most fun racing, actually.
How long did you have it?
I raced it in all those Lloyds and Scottish and Bamford stuff. I had it for about 5 or so years. And I used to do 17 meetings a year. And
what was it like to drive? What was everybody? Even Sterling Moss used to go on about the 250F. What was so great about the 250F?
Well, I'm not pretending to be a great driver. Okay, so I'm not pretending to be a great driver, because in historic racing, a lot of these historic racing boys, they really think they are Sterling Moss, and they're pretty good drivers, but they're not Sterling Moss, and they're not Fangio, and they're not in that league in my book. No. But what's it like? It was just a lovely, easy car to drive. It gave you a lot of confidence, and in the faster corners, you could set it up and you could just gently drift it, and it didn't feel twitchy. It just felt smooth. It just felt easy, and a nice engine, unfussy, pretty fast. Yeah, I think at Rickard we were clocked doing about 148 miles an hour.
Yeah.
Gearing we had, pretty fast, really.
Yeah, plenty fast enough. Breezy.
Yeah.
So there's a transition. I mean, I know you best for the aeroplanes.
Yeah.
And there's obviously a transition, wasn't there?
There was.
There'd been a family connection with aircraft, and you had a license very early, didn't you? But
yeah.
Tell us how the emphasis changed to airplanes.
Well, yeah. what happened was I had a license very early because I was very lucky because my dad was very well known at the local flying club, and I went down there just when I was 17, and they really looked after me because, you know, my dad died when he was 46 and I was 14. So they knew my dad really well.
Where was I? Where was it?
Stapleford.
Oh, yeah.
Stapleford, yeah, which is a wonderful airfield and a lovely, lovely family who run it. It's just a great place to learn to fly, actually. And they've got the best cafe for bacon sandwiches and stuff like that you could ever imagine. Yeah, so I went down there, and I think they were at the time charging £7 10 shillings for a flying lesson. But I don't think I hardly ever paid. They just used to, you know, let me go flying and stamp. I got my license, but I didn't really have a need for it. I didn't know what I wanted to do. It was ending up costing quite a lot of money. But what happened was then I stopped the flying, and what then happened, we went to Patrick Lindsay's house for the weekend, and he had one of his biplanes there, a Stomp biplane. Lovely summer, sunny day. And he took me flying, and he took my wife Anne flying. And I fell in love with this biplane. You know, I'd never been in a biplane, open cockpit biplane. And I thought I've got to have one. And by chance, within a week, I met a guy who's a good friend of mine called Richard Good, who was captain of the British aerobatic team. And he had a Stomp that he wanted to sell.
Wow.
So I suddenly owned this airplane and couldn't really fly it properly. I crashed it actually on the first time I went to Silverstone. Raced my old car, crashed it on landing because I didn't know what I was doing. What was quite funny, Steve, was I had this RAF pilot with me who lived near we used to live, and he got over 25,000 hours flying Hercules aircraft all over the world.
Right.
And he came as a passenger, and we crashed on the runway, wiped the undercarriage off, and he jumped out and he said, God, he said, I've done lots of flights, but I've never been in a crash before. Anyway, yeah. So I then thought I'd better start learning to fly, otherwise I'm going to hurt myself. And what really turned me on it, Steve, on the flying was that basically Richard then told me that he would, if I took my biplane to air shows, in those days there were lots of air shows, they'd pay me to turn up, and he would fly the airplane till I learned how to fly it properly. And I was getting paid quite a lot of money to turn up and for my airplane to do a display. And, you know, unlike the car racing now, which you just have to pay huge amounts of money to entry, although in my days you didn't have to, because Marlborough, Baron Chulo de Graffenried used to get us all together and take us to Ricard and places like that just before the Grand Prix. And he'd give us 1,500 quid to go towards it, which would be enough money to get your tickets, drive the car down with a trailer behind and do the race. So, yeah, I then just got hooked on the flying, really. And the car, I had to sell the car, the 250F, to buy the definitive aerobatic single-seat aeroplane. So that's what I did, which was a Czechoslovakian aeroplane called a Zlin 50.
Right.
And I started training, and I felt really sick, kept feeling sick. And I'd train every day as much as I could until I felt sick. Then I'd stop. And I suddenly thought, you know, if I don't do something about this, I'm going to go broke very quickly. I've got to get a sponsor. So I managed to get Mitsubishi on board as the sponsor, and I was sponsored by them for 8 years, which was fantastic.
By then you were living down the road from them, weren't you? Just near Cirencester, where not far from where you are now.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I remember the Zlin 50. I can remember you putting on a demo for a few of us at Duxford, actually.
Yeah.
And I remember you departing upside down. So you took off, sort of inverted and climbed out upside down. It was quite a sight, I tell you.
Well, the thing about flying is to make the easy look difficult, you know. So I learned that very early on. Don't push the boat out and hurt yourself. Just do something that Joe Public thinks looks
Yeah.
great, and it's actually pretty easy to fly upside down.
I remember there was also a two-seaters, Lynn, wasn't there?
There was.
And I remember going up, you took me flying, and I remember going down the middle of the Kemble runway upside down at about, I don't know, 200 feet, would it be?
I must have been flying quite high that day, yeah.
I thought
yes, well, I had, and I still have actually, when they, it's pretty controlled now, air displays, and you have to have an air display license, and I've got an aerobatic clearance down to 30 feet. So yeah, wow. I can fly if I was so inclined, which I'm not inclined to do with a steerman biplane and wing walkers standing on top.
No. How did that all start? Because that's really been what you're known for in the last, I don't know, several decades, isn't it, really?
Yeah, it probably is. How it started, what happened? I then became pretty involved. In 1986, we had the World Aerobatic Championships in England, and our joint great friend at South Cerney.
Yeah.
And our joint great friend, God bless him, Steady Barker. I was trying to find them some sponsorship, and Steady said, well, look, I think I can get someone to sponsor you. So you know what Steady was like. The next thing I knew, I was being zoomed off to VW and with Steady. And I mean, they just agreed to sponsor it. They gave us 120 grand, which saved the whole event, really. And they made it a VIP event for them. Pretty boring competition aerobatics, because it's just like ice skating, doing circles and, accurate flying. But the last day we had an air show. And I remember quite funny thing, Steve, was that I was chosen to take His Royal Highness Prince Michael flying in a Stearman biplane. So, it's an honor to do that. I was a bit nervous. And they said, turn up, you must be there at least half an hour before His Royal Highness arrived. And they said, what you must definitely not do any aerobatics. I said, well, why is that? They said, well, we can't have him getting out of the airplane and puking up in front of the world's press and VW, boss of VW, with him puking up in front of everyone. So I said, oh, okay, fine. Anyway, so I arrived half an hour before, when I should do. And the next thing that happened, I remember it, was this ambulance turned up and parked at the end of the runway. And I said, well, what's that? And they said, well, that's a Royal Ambulance. I said, well, what do you mean, Royal? Well, they've got all his blood on board there. And if anything happens, I said, well, what about me? They said, oh, they won't worry about you. and then I also had, which was great, I had a purple airway. So, when the Royals fly, they have their purple airway where no one else is allowed to fly. So I had a purple airway as well. Anyway, His Royal Highness turned up. I was very polite, shook his hand as I would be. And I've taken him flying since then a few times. And he's a really nice guy. And he's a helicopter pilot, I think. Anyway, so we're soldiering around. And he said, well, aren't we going to do any aerobatics? I said, well, if you're telling me to, sir, yeah, sure. So he said, yeah, no, I want to do some aerobatics. So we then did aerobatics at Evering, and he loved it. He was fine. He was a great guy. And we landed, and he hopped out smiling and laughing and patting everyone on the back. And it was all forgotten, But it was quite amusing at the time. I wondered what the boss of VW was going to say.
Yeah, quite a laugh. Yeah, I remember that event. Yeah, but you must. So after that, though, you acquired a couple of steermen, and you finished up having 4 steermans, didn't you? Am I right? Or
I finished up having 6. But
okay.
But actually, the first aeroplane I got was I ended up going to an air show in California at a place called Salinas, and I saw a wing walking act with a steerman. And in our country, in the UK, there was someone doing wing walking, but it was with a tiger moth, and didn't have any performance, couldn't do any aerobatics. Little bit boring. Great fun, but a bit boring. And can you hear my dog snoring?
Yeah, that's not what it is.
Yeah, and I saw this aeroplane Stearman Act there, so I thought that would be great. And I also thought, getting older, I don't have to bash myself about too much doing aerobatics with high performance airplanes, because the new Russian airplanes were coming out, which were, very high G maneuvers, +9, -9 sort of thing.
Oh God, yeah.
And I wasn't that good, I was good enough, but I wasn't that good. And I thought, no, it'd be nice to do wing walk. It'd be a nice, easy job to do that. So I then came back, and actually a man like the god of air shows, it was a fellow called Ray Hanna. And yep. Ray Hanna was a New Zealander in the Air Force, and then became the leader of the Red Arrows, and was sort of the best leader the Red Arrows ever had. And he'd just bought from America a lovely Stearman aircraft. So I rang him up and I said, Ray, is there any chance you'd sell me your airplane? And he said, well, yeah, but it would be a hell of a lot of money. But I now had a sponsor, lined up. So I had Yugo Cars. You probably remember them.
I do, yeah, yeah.
And Mike Carey, who was the boss of Yugo Cars, he'd if he hadn't started, he was very, very early days in charge of the Red Devils Army parachute team.
Oh yes, yeah.
And he was very into flying. And so anyway, I went to see Ray at Duxford, had a trip round in the airplane, bit nervous because he was in the front seat, and I didn't want to make a mistake doing a loop or whatever. Yeah. And landed, and I said, well, right, I'd definitely like to buy the airplane. So he quoted a price that was a high price, more than it was worth. And I stuck my hand out and I said, okay, I'll have it. And he went, and sort of pulled his hand back. He said, well, look, let me think about it. Anyway, he rang me up that night and he said, look, I've got a friend in California called Gordon Plaskett. He's a crop dusting guy. He's into P-51 Mustangs. He built my airplane. He's got another one. And I went over to see him literally next week, and he had another lovely airplane nearly finished. I bought that off him, and that was our first airplane. So then what happened? Yugo Cars.
When were we talking about?
87.
Right. Yeah.
I bought it in 86, but 87 was our first air show season. 1987.
Gotcha. Yeah.
And it was hugely in demand, and it was a great show act. And then what happened was Yugo Cars, after, I can't remember, you'd remember when, probably about 89 or something.
Yeah.
And I was looking for another sponsor, and I'd agreed a deal actually with, I had a contract, but I hadn't signed it, with Olympus Cameras. And at the same time, I'd written a letter to various people just saying we were after sponsorship. And at the same time, Cadbury's came on board and they said, can we come and see you? Cadbury's Crunchy. And they said, well, we need to think about this. I said, well, look, you've got to make your mind up because, and I showed them the contract that I hadn't signed. And they said, okay, we'll go to a board meeting tomorrow. They said, what would make the difference? I said, I'd like 2 aeroplanes. And that's how it then became 2. Yeah. And then it just became more and more, because then the shows, we started doing shows all over the world, Steve.
Yeah, you used to put them in the crate and go to China, didn't you?
Yeah, we were. I mean, the China thing was just an amazing scenario. What happened? It was like 5 years ago. And basically, Cadbury's had done an advert by the Armand lot at Bristol, and they had a helter skelter, and they had a biplane with a wing walker on, and the Chinese had seen this, I think, and we got this funny email when emails had started, saying, would you bring your airplanes to China to do a show? And I thought it's ridiculous, just absolutely crazy, go to China. So the girl who worked for me, Helen, worked out a price, and I said, well, it's ridiculous, So I said, look, first of all, let's double the price because they're not going to do it anyway. So she said, okay. So she sent the price back to them, right? Doubled the price. And they came back within 24 hours saying, okay, we'd like to do it. I said, well, it's still a joke. They're not going to do it. I said, tell them we want half the money up front and the rest of the money before we leave the UK.
Bloody hell. So
she went, yeah. They came back the next day. Please give us your bank account. Within 24 hours, we had up. And then I was really worried because we had to make it happen. And, it was then. So I remember we going out to China. We arrived. I mean, there was no English. No one could speak anything. I mean, it was just unbelievable. And they had this big flash airport at a place called Zhuhai, where the containers had arrived. And we arrived there, started putting the airplanes together and everything. And then they had a big committee, an air show, and they had the Chinese Air Force there and all that stuff. And there was only the Chinese Air Force, us, and the Russians, right? The Russians were there with their Sukhoi jets. And I remember going to this big meeting, and there must have been 15 Chinese military personnel, all sitting at the big top table, all looking at us really. And they had an interpreter, and first of all spoke to the Russians and said, is it true that the Russian aerobatics team and the display team will do this, that, and the other and everything? And the Russians were kicking up a real fuss. They're saying, oh no, we need more time, we need extra fuel, we need this, we need that, we need everything. And you could see the Chinese guys were sort of getting a bit fed up. The Russians were really being awkward. So then it came to our turn, and the interpreter said, is it true? They used to call us the butterflies or something. Is it true that the butterfly team will do this, that, and the other and other? Anyway, so I stood up and I said, first of all, it's an honor to be asked here. We're so excited about being asked here. And will you tell, please, the chairman here, that we'll do whatever he wants us to do. We'll fly as many times as he wants us to. We'll do whatever he wants. And I sat down, and she didn't have to interpret it. The top man smiled at me and said, thank you very much, Mr. Norman. And from then on, we couldn't do a thing wrong. We could not do a thing wrong. We used to take off. They used to come on the control tower, which was a brand new building like Heathrow. And as soon as we took off, they used to all go outside and they said, can you fly around and run the control towers closely as you can? And where can we fly with the crowd? And it was a huge crowd. I mean, they couldn't control the crowd. There was like 1 million people or something. God. I think they were charging or making the Chinese companies buy tickets. I don't know how it worked. And people were bringing their babies for us to sign. And I mean, and then we had a film crew following us 24/7, watching us eat because we couldn't eat with chopsticks and all that stuff. And I have to say, they were fantastic, actually. It was really good fun. And we ended up going back every 2 or 3 years. So
there's we got a bit of a time problem, but there's a couple of things that I really have to ask you about. One is, tell us the story about the Kamikaze Pilot that you meant. Just tell everybody. It's a good story.
Yeah, so we've been asked to display in Japan, which was terribly exciting, at the American Air Base, Awakuni, I think it was called. And so we arrived there and we were displaying and everything. And I met this Japanese kamikaze pilot, so quite an old guy. And I asked, well, what's the story, kamikaze pilot? He said, and it came out through the interpreter, that basically he was had been trained to be a kamikaze pilot. He'd been home to his hometown for a celebration with his family. the week before he was to go on a mission, a kamikaze mission, and dive bomb and end up dying himself. And they had the big celebration and how it was an honor for him to be doing this for Japan and everything. And he gets on the train to go back to his squadron. And after about an hour and a half, the train stops. And what happened, of course, his hometown was Hiroshima, which had just been bombed.
Good, yeah.
And his whole family were wiped out. And he ended up really hating the Americans at that stage. And he ended up going back, not to Hiroshima, but to nearby. And he was with his childhood sweetheart, who he'd been going out with since he was like 12 or something. And he was waiting for a train, and they weren't allowed. The Japanese had to be separated from the Americans. And this American soldier, airman, started being very rude to his sweetheart, and he gave a punch to the guy, and he was arrested. And next morning ended up in a military court, and he said he thought he was going to be shot. And they said what had happened, and then at the back of the room, the American GI stood up and said, "Sir, it was me who did that. I was completely drunk. I was to blame. This man has done nothing wrong." And of course, they let him off. And from that moment on, he thought, well, not all Americans were bad guys. And he ended up being every year the guest of honor at this airbase, and was the most charming guy. And he was still with his childhood sweetheart. It's a lovely story, actually. Yeah.
Fantastic story. God.
Yeah.
Just before we really are going to run out of time, just tell us about, you got a rank in the RAF, haven't you? How did that happen?
Well, I have. Yeah, I'm an honorary air commodore. The Queen has made me an honorary air commodore, which is a huge privilege. Why they chose me, I've really no idea. But I think it was probably because I've been to so many air shows. I've done over 2,000 public air displays, and a lot of those on RAF bases. And of course, a lot of the RAF guys who then become very high ranking air marshals, etc., etc., I knew when they were just flight lieutenants, and we'd sort of all grown up together, I suppose. Yeah. And what happened then was, when the government decided that 20% of the country's fighting force had to be reservists, they brought back, in the RAF case, some of those ex-reservists, honorary reservist squadrons, and every squadron has to have an honorary air commodore. So they basically are the one that I am an honorary air commodore for, is in Cardiff and Glamorgan, 614 Squadron, and they opened a centre there, almost like a pop-up centre, to recruit people.
Yeah, and
it's been hugely successful. I think we've got around about 90 people fully trained now, serving. A lot of them were serving, of course, helping with the COVID, but they're serving all over the world, really, and it's working really well. So, yeah, it's a real honour to be involved with that.
I've seen you in the uniform, mate. It looks great.
Yeah, I think also nice. I'm also an ambassador for the Royal Air Force Association. And I get a lot of enjoyment out of that. And I've recently become a befriender. So I'm talking to a lovely man now. I can't tell you anything about him, obviously, but he's 94 years old, and he's just very lonely. And, a lot of these guys are just very, very lonely. And the Royal Air Force does look after everyone who asks for help. It's a fantastic organisation.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, look, thanks so much for talking to us, Vic. I would like to thank you for getting involved in this, but also for those that are watching, whatever you do, don't forget this book, Norman Conquest. It's what you've heard in the last 3/4 of an hour is about 1/500th of what's in the book. So there's a lot more to investigate yet. Anyway, goodbye. Thank you. Thanks a lot, Vic, and see you next time.
Yeah, we'll see you on the Pioneer Run, Steve, with our 1912 Douglases. And I hope you.
1913. It's obviously going.
Well, you'll overtake me then. You'll be going quicker than me.
See you later. Thanks, Vic.